Today, I'll be reading to you Kurt Vonnegut's short story, which was first written in 1953 and published in Galaxy Science Fiction magazine as The Big Trip Up Yonder. The story was written as a cautionary tale meant to remind readers that everything has an end, and for a good reason. The year was 2158 AD, and Lou and Emerald Schwartz were whispering on the balcony outside Lou's family's apartment on the 76th floor of Building 257 in Alden Village, a New York housing development that covered what had once been known as Southern Connecticut. When Lou and Emerald had married, Em's parents had tearfully described the marriage as being between May and December. But now, with Lou 112 and Em 93, Em's parents had to admit that the match had worked out well. But Em and Lou weren't without their troubles, and they were out in the nippy air of the balcony because of them. Sometimes I get so mad, I feel like just up and diluting his anti-gerasone, said Em. Well, that'd be against nature, Em, said Lou. It'd be murder. Besides, if he caught us tinkering with his anti-gerasone, not only would he disinherit us, but he'd bust my neck. Just because he's 172 doesn't mean Gramps isn't strong as a bull. Against nature, said Em. Who knows what nature's like anymore? Oh, I don't guess I could ever bring myself to dilute his anti-gerasone or anything like that, but gosh, Lou, the body can't help thinking Gramps is never going to leave if somebody doesn't help him along a little. Golly, we're so crowded, a person can hardly turn around, and Verna's dying for a baby, and Melissa's gone 30 years without one. She stamped her feet. I get so sick of seeing his wrinkled old face, watching him take the only private room and the best chair and the best food, and getting to pick out what to watch on TV, and running everybody's life by changing his will all the time. Well, after all, said Lou bleakly, Gramps is head of the family, and he can't help being wrinkled like he is. He was 70 before anti-gerasone was invented, and he's going to leave, Em. Just give him some time. It's his business. I know he's tough to live with, but be patient. It wouldn't do to do anything that'd rile him. After all, we've got it better than anybody else. They're on the daybed. How much longer do you think we'll get to sleep on the daybed before he picks another pet? The world's record's what, 2 months, isn't it? Mom and Pop had it that long once, I guess. When's he gonna leave, Lou? Said Emerald. Well, he's talking about giving up anti-gerasone right after the 500-mile speedway race. Yes, and before that it was the Olympics, and before that the World Series, before that the presidential elections, and before that I don't know what. It's just been one excuse after another for 50 years now. I don't think we're ever going to get a room to ourselves or an egg or anything. All right, just call me a failure, said Lou. What can I do? I work hard, I make good money. But the whole thing practically is taxed away for defense and old age pensions. And if it wasn't taxed away, where do you think we'd find a vacant room to rent? Iowa, maybe? Well, who wants to live on the outskirts of Chicago? Em put her arms around his neck. Lou, hon, I'm not calling you a failure. The Lord knows you're not. You just haven't had a chance to be anything or have anything because Gramps and the rest of his generation won't leave and let somebody else take over. Yeah, said Lou gloomily. You can't exactly blame them, though, can you? I mean, I wonder how quick we'll knock off the anti-gerasone when we get Gramps' age. Sometimes I wish there wasn't any such thing as an anti-gerasone, said Emerald passionately. Or I wish it was made out of something real expensive and hard to get instead of mud and dandelions. Sometimes I wish folks just up and died regular as clockwork, without anything to say about it, instead of deciding themselves how long they're going to stay around. There ought to be a law against selling the stuff to anybody over 150. Fat chance of that, said Lou, with all the money and votes the old people have got. He looked at her closely. You ready to up and die, Em? Well, for heaven's sake, what a thing to say to your wife. Hon, I'm not even 100 yet. She ran her hands lightly over her firm, youthful figure, as though for confirmation. The best years of my life are still ahead of me, but you can bet that when 150 rolls around, old M's going to purr her anti-gerasone down the sink and quit taking up room, and she'll do it smiling. Sure, said Lou, you bet. That's what they all say. How many you heard of doing it? Well, there was that man in Delaware. Aren't you getting kind of tired of talking about him, Em? That was 5 months ago. All right, then. Grandma Winkler, right here in the same building. She got smeared by a subway. That's just the way she picked to go, said Em. Then what was she doing carrying a 6-pack of anti-gerasone when she got it? Emerald shook her head wearily and covered her eyes. I don't know. All I know is something's just got to be done. Sometimes I wish they'd left a couple of diseases kicking around somewhere, so I could get one and at least go to bed for a little while. Too many people, she cried, and her words cackled and gabbled and died in 1,000 asphalt-paved, skyscraper-walled courtyards. Lou laid his hand on her shoulder tenderly. Aw, hon, I hate to see you down in the dumps like this. If we just had a car, like the folks used to in the old days, said Em, we could go for a drive and get away from people for a little while. Gee, if those weren't the days. Yeah, said Lou, before they'd used up all the metal. We'd hop in, Papa'd drive up to a filling station and say, fill her up? That was the nuts, wasn't it? Before they used up all the gasoline. And we'd go for a carefree ride in the country. Yeah, all seems like a fairyland now, doesn't it? Hard to believe there really used to be all that space between cities. And when we got hungry, said Em, we'd find ourselves a restaurant. We'd walk in, big as you please, and say, I'll have a steak and french fries, I believe, or how are the pork chops today? She licked her lips and her eyes glistened. Yeah, man, growled Lou. How'd you like a hamburger with the works, Em? Mm-mm. If anybody'd offered us processed seaweed in those days, we would have spit right in his eye, huh, Em? Or processed sawdust, said Em. Doggedly, Lou tried to find the cheery side of the situation. Well, anyway, they've got the stuff, so it tastes a lot less like seaweed and sawdust than it did at first, and they say it's actually better for us than what we used to eat. I felt fine, said Em fiercely. Lou shrugged. Well, you've got to realize, the whole world wouldn't be able to support 12 billion people if it wasn't for processed seaweed and sawdust. I mean, it's a wonderful thing, really, I guess. That's what they say. They say the first thing that pops into their head, said Em. She closed her eyes. Golly, remember shopping, Lou? Remember how the stores used to fight to get our folks to buy something? You didn't have to wait for somebody to die to get a bed or chairs or a stove or anything like that. Just went in, bing, and bought whatever you wanted. Gee whiz, that was nice. Before they used up all the raw materials. I was just a little kid then, but I can remember so plain. Depressed, Lou walked listlessly to the balcony's edge and looked up at the clean, cold, bright stars against the black velvet of infinity. Remember when we used to be bugs on science fiction, Em? Flight 17 leaving for Mars, launching ramp 12, board. All non-technical personnel kindly remain in bunkers. 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Main stage. Boom. Well, why worry about what was going on Earth, said Em, looking up at the stars with him. In another few years, we'd all be shooting through space to start life all over again on a new planet. Lou sighed. Only, it turns out you need something about twice the size of the Empire State Building to get one lousy colonist to Mars. And for another couple of $1 trillion, he could take his wife and dog. That's the way to lick overpopulation. Immigrate. Lou? When's the 500-mile speedway race? Memorial Day, May 30th. She bit her lip. Was that awful of me to ask? Not very, I guess. Everybody in the apartments looked it up to make sure. Well, I don't want to be awful, said Em, but you've just got to talk over these things now and then and get them out of your system. Sure you do. You feel better? Yes. And I'm not going to lose my temper anymore. I'm going to be just as nice to him as I know how. Well, that's my Em. They squared their shoulders, smiled bravely, and went back inside. Gramps Schwartz, his chin resting on his hands on the crook of his cane, was staring irascibly at the 5-foot television screen that dominated the room. On the screen, a news commentator was summarizing the day's happenings. Every 30 seconds or so, Gramps would jab the floor with his cane tip and shout, "Hell, we did that 100 years ago!" Emerald and Lou, coming in from the balcony, were obliged to take seats in the back row, behind Lou's father and mother, brother and sister-in-law, son and daughter-in-law, grandson and wife, granddaughter and husband, great-grandson and wife, nephew and wife, grandnephew and wife, great-grandniece and husband, great-grandnephew and wife, and, of course, Gramps, who was in front of everybody. All, save Gramps, who was somewhat withered and bent, seemed, by pre-anti-Gerasone standards, to be about the same age, to be somewhere in their late 20s or early 30s. Meanwhile, the commentator was saying, Council Bluffs, Iowa was still threatened by stark tragedy, but 200 weary rescue workers have refused to give up hope and continue to dig in an effort to save Elbert Hagedorn, 183, who has been wedged for 2 days in a... I wish he'd get something more cheerful, Emerald whispered to Lou. Silence! Cried Gramps. Next one shoots off his big bazoo while the TV's on is going to find himself cut off without $1. And here his voice suddenly softened and sweetened. When they wave that checkered flag at the Indianapolis Speedway and old Gramps gets ready for the big trip up yonder. He sniffed sentimentally, while his heirs concentrated desperately on not making the slightest sound. For them, the poignancy of the prospective big trip had been dulled somewhat by its having been mentioned by Gramps about once a day for 50 years. Dr. Brainard Keyes Bullard, said the commentator, president of Wyandotte College, said in an address tonight that most of the world's ills can be traced to the fact that man's knowledge of himself has not kept pace with his knowledge of the physical world. Hell, said Gramps, we said that 100 years ago. In Chicago tonight, said the commentator, a special celebration is taking place in the Chicago Lying-In Hospital. The guest of honor is Lowell W. Hitz, age 0. Hitz, born this morning, is the 25 millionth child to be born in the hospital. The commentator faded and was replaced on the screen by young Hitz, who squalled furiously. "Hell," whispered Lou to Emerald. "We said that 100 years ago." "I heard that," shouted Gramps. He snapped off the television set, and his petrified descendants stared silently at the screen. "You there, boy!" "I didn't mean anything by it, sir," said Lou. "Get me my will. You know where it is. You kids all know where it is. Fetch, boy." Lou nodded dully and found himself going down the hall, picking his way over bedding to Gramps' room, the only private room in the Schwartz apartment. The other rooms were the bathroom, the living room, and the wide, windowless hallway, which was originally intended to serve as a dining area and which had a kitchenette in one end. 6 mattresses and 4 sleeping bags were dispersed in the hallway and living room, and the daybed in the living room accommodated the 11th couple, the favorites of the moment. On Gramps' bureau was his will, smeared, dog-eared, perforated, and blotched with hundreds of additions, deletions, accusations, conditions, warnings, advice, and homely philosophy. The document was, Lou reflected, a 50-year diary, all jammed onto 2 sheets, a garbled, illegible log of day after day of strife. This day, Lou would be disinherited for the 11th time, and it would take him perhaps 6 months of impeccable behavior to regain the promise of a share in the estate. "Boy!" called Gramps. "Coming, sir." Lou hurried back into the living room and handed Gramps the will. "Pen," said Gramps. He was instantly offered 11 pens, 1 from each couple. "Not that leaky thing," he said, brushing Lou's pen aside. "Ah, there's a nice one. Good boy, Willie." He accepted Willie's pen. That was the tip they'd all been waiting for. Willie, then, Lou's father, was the new favorite. Willie, who looked almost as young as Lou, though 142, did a poor job of concealing his pleasure. He glanced shyly at the daybed, which would become his and from which Lou and Emerald would have to move back into the hall, back to the worst spot of all by the bathroom door. Gramps missed none of the high drama he'd authored, and he gave his own familiar role everything he had, frowning and running his finger along each line as though he were seeing the will for the first time. He read aloud in a deep, portentous monotone, like a bass tone on a cathedral organ. "I, Harold D. Schwartz, residing in Building 257 of Alden Village, New York City, do hereby make, publish, and declare this to be my last will and testament, hereby revoking any and all former wills and codicils by me at any time heretofore made." He blew his nose importantly and went on, not missing a word and repeating many for emphasis, repeating in particular his ever more elaborate specifications for a funeral. At the end of these specifications, Gramps was so choked with emotion that Lou thought he might forget why he'd gotten out the will in the first place. But Gramps heroically brought his powerful emotions under control, and after erasing for a minute, he began to write and speak at the same time. Lou could have spoken his lines for him. He'd heard them so often. "I have had many heartbreaks ere leaving this vale of tears for a better land," Gramps said and wrote. "But the deepest hurt of all has been dealt me by—" He looked around the group, trying to remember who the malefactor was. Everyone looked helpfully at Lou, who held up his hand resignedly. Gramps nodded, remembering, and completed the sentence. "My great-grandson, Louis J. Schwartz." "Grandson, sir," said Lou. "Don't quibble. You're in deep enough now, young man," said Gramps, but he changed the trifle, and from there he went, without a mistake, through the phrasing of the disinheritance, causes for which were disrespectfulness and quibbling. In the paragraph following, the paragraph that had belonged to everyone in the room at one time or another, Lou's name was scratched out and Willie's substituted as heir to the apartment, and, the biggest plum of all, the double bed in the private bedroom. "So," said Gramps, beaming. He erased the date at the foot of the will and substituted a new one, including the time of day. "Well, time to watch the McGarvey Family." The McGarvey Family was a television serial that Gramps had been following since he was 60, or for 112 years. "I can't wait to see what's going to happen next," he said. Lou detached himself from the group and lay down on his bed of pain by the bathroom door. He wished Em would join him, and he wondered where she was. He dozed for a few moments until he was disturbed by someone stepping over him to get into the bathroom. A moment later, he heard a faint gurgling sound, as though something were being poured down the wash basin drain. Suddenly, it entered his mind that Em had cracked up, and that she was in there doing something drastic about Gramps. "Em?" he whispered through the panel. There was no reply, and Lou pressed against the door. The worn lock, whose bolt barely engaged its socket, held for a second, and then let the door swing inward. "Morty!" gasped Lou. Lou's great-grandnephew, Mortimer, who had just married and brought his wife home to the Schwartz menage, looked at Lou with consternation and surprise. Morty kicked the door shut, but not before Lou had glimpsed what was in his hand. Gramps' enormous, economy-sized bottle of anti-gerasone, which had been half emptied and which Morty was refilling to the top with tap water. A moment later, Morty came out, glared defiantly at Lou, and brushed past him wordlessly to rejoin his pretty bride. Shocked, Lou didn't know what on earth to do. He couldn't let Gramps take the mouse-trapped anti-gerasone, but if he warned Gramps about it, Gramps would certainly make life in the apartment, which was merely insufferable now, harrowing. Lou glanced into the living room and saw that the Schwartzes, Emerald among them, were momentarily at rest, relishing the botches the McGarveys had made of their lives. Stealthily, he went into the bathroom, locked the door as well as he could, and began to pour the contents of Gramps' bottle down the drain. He was going to refill it with full-strength anti-gerasone from the 22 smaller bottles on the shelf. The bottle contained a half-gallon, and its neck was small, so it seemed to Lou that the emptying would take forever. And the almost imperceptible smell of anti-gerasone, like Worcestershire sauce, now seemed to Lou, in his nervousness, to be pouring out into the rest of the apartment through the keyhole and under the door. Glug, 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 went the bottle monotonously. Suddenly, up came the sound of music from the living room, and there were murmurs and the scraping of chair legs on the floor. "Thus ends," said the television announcer, "the 291,215th chapter in the life of your neighbors and mine, the McGarveys." Footsteps were coming down the hall, and there was a knock on the door. "Just a sec," called Lou cheerily. Desperately, he shook the big bottle, trying to speed up the flow. His palms slipped on the wet glass, and the heavy bottle smashed to splinters on the tile floor. The door sprung open, and Gramps, dumbfounded, stared at the mess. Lou grinned engagingly through his nausea, and, for want of anything remotely resembling a thought, he waited for Gramps to speak. "Well, boy," said Gramps at last, "it looks like you've got a little tidying up to do." And that was all he said. He turned around, elbowed his way through the crowd, and locked himself in his bedroom. The Schwartzes contemplated Lou in incredulous silence for a moment longer, and then hurried back to the living room, as though some of his horrible guilt would taint them too, if they looked too long. Morty stayed behind long enough to give Lou a quizzical, annoyed glance, and then he too went into the living room, leaving only Emerald standing in the doorway. Tears streamed over her cheeks. "Oh, you poor lamb," Please don't look so awful. It was my fault. I put you up to this. No, said Lou, finding his voice. Really, you didn't. Honest, Em. I was just... You don't have to explain anything to me, hon. I'm on your side, no matter what. She kissed him on his cheek and whispered in his ear. It wouldn't have been murder, hon. It wouldn't have killed him. It wasn't such a terrible thing to do. It just would have fixed him up so he'd be able to go any time God decided he wanted him. What's going to happen next, Em? Said Lou hollowly. What's he going to do? Lou and Emerald stayed fearfully awake almost all night, waiting to see what Gramps was going to do. But not a sound came from the sacred bedroom. At 2 hours before dawn, the pair dropped off to sleep. At 6 o'clock they arose again, for it was time for their generation to eat breakfast in the kitchenette. No one spoke to them. They had 20 minutes in which to eat, but their reflexes were so dulled by the bad night that they had hardly swallowed 2 mouthfuls of egg-type processed seaweed before it was time to surrender their places to their son's generation. Then, as was the custom for whomever had been most recently disinherited, they began preparing Gramps' breakfast, which would presently be served to him in a bed on a tray. They tried to be cheerful about it. The toughest part of the job was having to handle the honest-to-God eggs and bacon and oleomargarine on which Gramps spent almost all of the income from his fortune. Well, said Emerald, I'm not going to get all panicky until I'm sure there's something to be panicky about. Maybe he doesn't know what it was I busted, said Lou hopefully. Probably thinks it was your watch crystal, said Eddie, their son, who was toying apathetically with his buckwheat-type processed sawdust cakes. Don't get sarcastic with your father, said Em, and don't talk with your mouth full either. I'd like to see anybody take a mouthful of this stuff and not say something, said Eddie, who was 73. He glanced at the clock. It's time to take Gramps' breakfast, you know. Yeah, it is, isn't it, said Lou weakly. He shrugged. Let's have the tray in. We'll both go. Walking slowly, smiling bravely, they found a large semicircle of long-faced Schwartzes standing around the bedroom door. Em knocked. Gramps, she said brightly, breakfast is ready. There was no reply, and she knocked again, harder. The door swung open before her fist. In the middle of the room, the soft, deep, wide, canopied bed, the symbol of the sweet by and by to every Schwartz, was empty. A sense of death as unfamiliar to the Schwartzes as Zoroastrianism or the causes of the Sepoy mutiny stilled every voice and slowed every heart. Awed, their heirs began to search gingerly under the furniture and behind the drapes for all that was mortal of Gramps, father of the race. But Gramps had left not his earthly husk but a note, which Lou finally found on the dresser under a paperweight which was a treasured souvenir from the 2000 World's Fair. Unsteadily, Lou read it aloud. Somebody who I have sheltered and protected and taught the best I know how all these years, last night turned on me like a mad dog and diluted my anti-gerasone, or tried to. I am no longer a young man. I can no longer bear the crushing burden of life as I once could. So, after last night's bitter experience, I say goodbye. The cares of this world will soon drop away like a cloak of thorns, and I shall know peace. By the time you find this, I will be gone. Gosh, said Willie brokenly. He didn't even get to see how the 500-mile speedway race was going to come out. Or the World Series, said Eddie. Or whether Mrs. McGarvey got her eyesight back, said Morty. There's more, said Lou, and he began reading aloud again. I, Harold D. Schwartz, do hereby make, publish, and declare this to be my last will and testament, hereby revoking any and all former will and codicils by me at any time heretofore made." "No," cried Willie, "not another one." "I do stipulate," read Lou, "that all of my property, of whatsoever kind and nature, not be divided, but do devise and bequeath it to be held in common by my issue, without regard for generation, equally share and share alike." "Issue?" said Emerald. Lou included the multitude in a sweep of his hands. "It means we all own the whole damn shooting match." All eyes turned instantly to the bed. "Share and share alike?" said Morty. "Actually," said Willie, who was the oldest person present, "it's just like the old system, where the oldest people head up things with their headquarters in here, and—" "I like that," said Em. "Lou owns as much of it as you do, and I say it ought to be the oldest one who's still working. You can snooze around here all day, waiting for your pension check, and poor Lou stumbles in here after work, all tuckered out, and—" "How about letting somebody who's never had any privacy get a little crack at it?" said Eddie hotly. "Hell, you old people had plenty of privacy back when you were kids. I was born and raised in the middle of the goddamn barracks in the hall. How about—" "Yeah," said Morty. "Sure, you've all had it pretty tough, and my heart bleeds for you, but try honeymooning in the hall for a real kick." "Silence!" shouted Willie imperiously. "The next person who opens its mouth spends the next 6 months by the bathroom. Now clear out of my room. I want to think." A vase shattered against the wall, inches above his head. In the next moment, a free-for-all was underway, with each couple battling to eject every other couple from the room. Fighting coalitions formed and dissolved with the lightning changes of the tactical situation. Em and Lou were thrown into the hall, where they organized others in the same situation and stormed back into the room. After 2 hours of struggle, with nothing like a decision in sight, the cops broke in. For the next half hour, patrol wagons and ambulances hauled away Schwartz's, and then the apartment was still and spacious. An hour later, films of the last stages of the riot were being televised to 500 million delighted viewers on the eastern seaboard. In the stillness of the three-room Schwartz apartment, on the 76th floor of Building 257, the television set had been left on. Once more, the air was filled with the cries and grunts and crashes of the fray, coming harmlessly now from the loudspeaker. The battle also appeared on the screen of the television set in the police station, where the Schwartzes and their captors watched with professional interest. Em and Lou were in adjacent 4x8 cells, and were stretched out peacefully on their cots. "Em," called Lou through the partition, "you got a wash basin all your own, too?" "Sure. Wash basin, bed, light, the works. Ha! And we thought Gramps' room was something. How long's this been going on?" She held out her hand. "For the first time in 40 years, hon, I haven't got the shakes." "Cross your fingers," said Lou. "The lawyer is going to try to get us a year." "Gee," said Em dreamily, "I wonder what kind of wires you'd have to pull to get solitary." "All right, pipe down," said the turnkey, "or I'll toss the whole kit and caboodle of you right out. And the first one who lets on to anybody outside how good jail is ain't never getting back in." The prisoners instantly fell silent. The living room of the Schwartz apartment darkened for a moment, as the riot scenes faded, and then the face of the announcer appeared, like the sun coming from behind a cloud. "And now, friends," he said, "I have a special message from the makers of anti-gerasone. A message for all you folks over 150. Are you hampered socially by wrinkles, by stiffness of joints and discoloration or loss of hair? all because these things came upon you before anti-gerasone was developed? Well, if you are, you need no longer suffer, need no longer feel different and out of things. After years of research, medical science has now developed super anti-gerasone. In weeks, yes weeks, you can look, feel, and act as young as your great-great-grandchildren. Wouldn't you pay $5,000 to be indistinguishable from everybody else? Well, you don't have to. Safe, tested super anti-gerasone costs you only dollars a day. The average cost of regaining all the sparkle and attractiveness of youth is less than $50. Right now, for your free trial carton, just put your name and address on a dollar postcard and mail it to Super, Box 500,000, Schenectady, New York. Have you got that? I'll repeat it. Super, Box 500,000, Schenectady, New York. Underlining the announcer's words was the scratching of Gramps' fountain pen, the one Willie had given him the night before. He had come in a few minutes previous from the Idle Hour Tavern, which commanded a view of Building 257 across the square of asphalt known as the Alden Village Green. He had called a cleaning woman to come straighten the place up, and had hired the best lawyer in town to get his descendants a conviction. Gramps had then moved the daybed before the television screen so that he could watch from a reclining position. It was something he'd dreamed of doing for years. Schenectady, mouthed Gramps. Got it. His face had changed remarkably. His facial muscles seemed to have relaxed, revealing kindness and equanimity under what had been taught bad-tempered lines. It was almost as though his trial package of super anti-gerasone had already arrived. When something amused him on television, he smiled easily, rather than barely managing to lengthen the thin line of his mouth a millimeter. Life was good. He could hardly wait to see what was going to happen next.